The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Dr. James Walker sat in his lab, staring at his computer screen with a confused look on his face. The readings made no sense. His quantum sensors were picking up energy patterns that shouldn't exist. He rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his coffee mug, only to notice something strange. The steam rising from his coffee seemed to freeze in midair. For a split second, time itself appeared to hiccup. Did anyone else see that? He called out to his team. But before anyone could answer, every screen in the lab began flashing with warnings. Miles away, in New York City, pedestrians stopped in their tracks as the sky rippled like water. In London, Big Ben struck noon 17 times, even though it was only 9 a.m. In Tokyo, birds flew backward for exactly 3 seconds. Back in the lab, Dr. Walker's equipment was going crazy. "These readings are impossible," he muttered, typing frantically. The energy signatures were unlike anything recorded in human history. They seemed to exist in multiple places at once, breaking every known law of physics. Then came the lights. They started as small tears in the sky, like someone had taken scissors to the fabric of reality. These tears grew larger, spreading across the horizon like cracks in glass. Through these openings came the ships, if you could call them ships at all. They were crystalline structures that seemed to phase in and out of existence. Sometimes they looked solid, other times they were transparent like ghost ships. They appeared over every major city on Earth, hovering silently. The military responded first. Fighter jets scrambled worldwide, but their pilots reported strange problems. Radar couldn't lock onto the ships. They appeared to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Dr. Walker watched the news feeds with growing concern. His instruments showed that these objects weren't just floating in the sky. They were distorting time itself around them. "Get me Washington on a line," he ordered his assistant. "They need to know what we're dealing with." But before he could make the call, every digital device on Earth flickered. Phones, computers, satellites. Everything connected to the internet began to fail. It wasn't a normal shutdown. The devices weren't just turning off. Their entire operating histories were being erased. The beings finally revealed themselves after 3 hours of global panic. They appeared on every working screen and radio frequency simultaneously. Their forms were hard to look at, constantly shifting shapes that hurt the human eye. "We are the Timmy-keepers," they announced in a voice that seemed to echo from both the past and future. "Your species has been identified as a temporal anomaly. Your existence threatens the stability of all timelines. Containment protocols have begun." Dr. Walker recorded everything, his old analog equipment still working while digital systems failed worldwide. He noticed something crucial. Each time the alien spoke, his quantum sensors detected massive spikes in temporal energy. "They're not just invading our space," he realized, scribbling calculations on a paper notepad. "They're invading our time." The first day of the invasion ended with humanity in shock. The aliens hadn't fired a single weapon, yet they had crippled global communications. Military leaders couldn't coordinate. Governments couldn't function. The digital age humanity had built was being dismantled hour by hour. That night, as Dr. Walker worked by candlelight in his lab, he made a discovery that chilled him to the bone. The aliens weren't just erasing data, they were erasing history itself. Small things at first, patents never filed, discoveries never made, innovations that simply ceased to exist. He wrote his findings in a leather-bound journal, knowing digital records couldn't be trusted anymore. As he looked out his window at the crystalline ship hovering over the city, he realized humanity wasn't just fighting for survival in the present. They were fighting for their very existence across time itself. The war had begun, and humanity's greatest challenge wouldn't be fighting an alien force. It would be preventing themselves from being erased from history altogether. 3 days after the Timmy-keepers' arrival, Major Amanda Stone stood in an underground military bunker, watching the last working television screen flicker with static. The aliens had already wiped out most of the world's technology, but they had kept a few channels running, probably to let humanity watch its own downfall. "Show me those photos again," she ordered, turning to Dr. Walker. He spread several Polaroid pictures across the metal table. They had discovered that old analog cameras still worked perfectly. The images showed the crystalline ships, but each photo was slightly different, as if the vessels existed in multiple forms at once. "They're not just aliens," Dr. Walker explained, pointing to the strange patterns in the photos. "They're time travelers who have evolved beyond physical form. They exist in multiple moments simultaneously." A soldier burst into the room. "Major Stone, they're making their move." Above ground, the Timmy Keepers had finally begun their physical attack. Their ships released waves of temporal energy that swept through cities like invisible tsunamis. People caught in these waves didn't die. They simply ceased to exist. One moment they were there, the next, they had never been born. "Our weapons are useless," Major Stone said, watching through binoculars as tanks fired shells straight through the alien forms. "The bullets pass right through them because they're not fully in our timeline." Dr. Walker worked frantically at his makeshift lab bench, surrounded by old analog equipment. He had noticed something strange during the attacks, a peculiar blue glow that appeared whenever the aliens phased between timelines. "Major, look at this." He held up a small device made from clock parts and modified quantum sensors. "They're not invincible. They're anchored to our timeline through quantum entanglement. It's how they maintain their presence here." A massive explosion rocked the bunker. Through the security cameras, they watched as a group of Timmy Keepers passed through the outer walls like ghosts. Their forms shifted and changed, sometimes looking almost human, other times appearing as twisted shapes of light and shadow. "Everyone fall back to the inner chambers," Major Stone commanded. But as her soldiers retreated, she noticed something crucial. The aliens couldn't pass through walls that contained lid shielding. Dr. Walker saw it too. "The lead disrupts their quantum field," he said excitedly. "They may be time travelers, but they still have to follow some physical laws." The discovery gave them their first real advantage. Major Stone quickly ordered all civilians to take shelter in old fallout bunkers and lead-lined basement rooms. It wasn't a solution, but it gave them time to think. That evening, as survivors huddled in the protected areas, Dr. Walker made another breakthrough. He had been studying the patterns of the aliens' attacks and noticed they always moved in perfect synchronization, like dancers following an invisible choreographer. "They're networked," he explained to Major Stone. "All of them, every single one, is connected through time itself. They share a single consciousness spread across multiple bodies." "How does that help us?" she asked, cleaning her useless rifle out of habit. "If they're all connected," Dr. Walker said slowly, his eyes lighting up with realization, "then they all share the same weakness. We don't need to fight each one individually. We just need to find a way to attack their network." Major Stone understood immediately. She gathered the remaining military leaders and scientists. Together, they formed humanity's first real resistance against the Timmy Keepers. They had no advanced technology, no modern weapons, and no way to communicate except through paper notes and human messengers. But they had found hope, a small crack in the aliens' seemingly perfect armor. As the resistance groups spread out through the lead-shielded tunnels beneath the city, they carried with them the first strategic advantage humanity had gained. The Timmy Keepers might be able to control time, but they had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and overcome. The real fight was about to begin. 1 week into the invasion, Dr. Walker found himself in an unusual classroom. He had converted an old subway maintenance tunnel into a research lab, its walls lined with lead sheets. Around him sat a mix of soldiers and scientists, all watching as he examined something extraordinary, a piece of captured timekeeper technology. It looked like a crystal about the size of a tennis ball, but it didn't always look like that. Sometimes it appeared smaller, sometimes larger, and sometimes it wasn't there at all. They had recovered it when one of the alien ships briefly materialized too close to a lid barrier, causing part of its structure to solidify. "Watch this," Dr. Walker said, holding up an old pocket watch next to the crystal. The watch's hands began spinning wildly, forward, backward, then stopping completely. They don't just travel through time. They bend it, shape it, like we shape metal or plastic. Major Stone entered the room, carrying a stack of paper reports. Since digital communication was impossible, the Resistance had gone old school. Runners carried messages between bunkers, using codes written on paper that would burn if the wrong person tried to read them. "We've spotted something strange," she announced, spreading hand-drawn maps on the table. "Every time the Timmy-keepers erase something from existence, there's a pattern left behind, like a shadow or an echo." Dr. Walker rushed to examine the maps. Each marked location showed where significant human achievements had been erased. The light bulb's invention, gone. The discovery of penicillin, never happened. The first computer, erased from time. "They're not just attacking us in the present," he realized, connecting dots on the map. "They're systematically erasing human innovation throughout history. But why leave traces?" An old professor named Miller spoke up from the corner. He had been studying the crystal using basic tools, magnifying glasses, prisms, and light sources. Because they can't completely remove something from all timelines at once. It takes enormous energy. That's why they're networked together. Major Stone pointed to a new marking on the map. "This appeared an hour ago. It's their ship, but it looks different. More solid." Dr. Walker grabbed his modified quantum sensor, built from salvaged clock parts and old radio components. The readings were clear. The Timmy-keepers were gathering their forces, concentrating their temporal energy. "They're preparing for something big," he said. "Every time they delete a major human achievement, they have to anchor themselves more firmly in our timeline to do it. That's why their ship is becoming more solid." A young scientist burst into the room, clutching a notebook filled with calculations. She had been monitoring the aliens' energy patterns using handmade equipment. "Dr. Major, look at this. Their network has a hierarchy. Some timekeepers are more connected than others. There's a pattern, like a pyramid." This was the breakthrough they needed. Dr. Walker quickly sketched a diagram on the wall. If the Timmy-keepers were organized in a hierarchy, then their network wasn't just a way to share information. It was their lifeline to their home dimension. Major Stone understood immediately. If we can disrupt their connection to their home dimension, we might be able to trap them here, Dr. Walker finished. And if they're trapped in a single timeline, they become vulnerable, Professor Miller added, his eyes wide with realization. The room buzzed with energy as people began sketching plans and running calculations. For the first time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were finding a way to fight back. Dr. Walker held up the crystal, watching it shift and change. "They think they're erasing us from time," he said quietly. "But they've actually given us exactly what we need to understand them." Major Stone nodded grimly. "Then let's make sure we use it. Because next time they try to erase something from history, we'll be ready," Dr. Walker said, already drawing up plans for a new device. The crystal pulsed in his hand, as if aware that its secrets were finally being uncovered. 2 weeks had passed since the capture of the alien crystal, and Dr. Walker hadn't slept in 3 days. His underground lab was now filled with strange devices built from old watches, radio parts, and pieces of lid. The crystal sat in the center of it all, connected to a maze of copper wires and mechanical sensors. "It's ready," he announced to Major Stone, who had just arrived with her daily report. "The temporal scanner. It's crude, but it works." He flipped a switch, and the room filled with clicking sounds as dozens of old clock mechanisms began turning in perfect synchronization. The crystal pulsed with a soft blue light, and above it, brass rings spun in complex patterns. "What exactly are we looking at?" Major Stone asked, watching shadows dance on the wall. "Time itself," Dr. Walker replied. or more specifically, the way the Keepers move through it. Look at this pattern. He pointed to where the shadows formed a spiral. They're not just traveling through time. They're constantly maintaining their connection to thousands of different moments simultaneously. Professor Miller walked in, carrying a stack of papers covered in complex equations. Like a tree with roots spread through different layers of soil, he added. But trees need those roots to survive. Exactly, Dr. Walker said excitedly. And that's their weakness. The Keepers must maintain quantum coherence, a perfect harmony between all their different time states. If that harmony is broken, a loud alarm suddenly rang through the bunker. Above ground, 3 Keeper ships had appeared, more solid than ever before. They were erasing another major historical event, the invention of radio communication. But this time, something was different. Dr. Walker's temporal scanner went wild, its rings spinning faster than ever before. The crystal began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched tone. "Look at these readings," Professor Miller shouted, pointing to the shadows. "When they concentrate their power like this, all their quantum states align. They become more solid, more present in our timeline, but also more vulnerable." Major Stone watched through her binoculars as the alien ships pulsed with energy. Vulnerable how? Dr. Walker rushed to his workbench and began sketching a new design. Their entire invasion force, every single timekeeper, they're all quantum entangled. It's what gives them their power, but it's also a massive weakness. If we could disrupt that entanglement, we could cut them off from their home dimension, Professor Miller finished, understanding dawning on his face. "Not just that," Dr. Walker said, his hands shaking with excitement. "We could erase them from every timeline they exist in. They'd be removed from history itself, just like they've been doing to us." Major Stone leaned over the design. "Can we build it?" "It would take enormous power," Professor Miller warned, "and we'd have to get it exactly right. One mistake, and we could accidentally erase ourselves instead." Dr. Walker looked at his temporal scanner, watching the patterns of time flow around the crystal. "We'll need resources, old power stations that haven't been erased yet, and we'll need to work fast. They're accelerating their attacks." "What should we call it?" Major Stone asked, already making lists of what they'd need. "Project Orphan," Dr. Walker said quietly. "Because if it works, the Keepers will be cut off from their own history. They'll become orphans in time, just before they cease to exist completely." The 3 of them stood in silence, watching the alien crystal pulse with its otherworldly light. They had found a way to fight back, but the cost of failure would be absolute. If they failed, humanity wouldn't just lose the war. They would never have existed at all. "Start gathering the materials," Major Stone ordered. "I'll coordinate with the other resistance cells. Whatever it takes, whatever we need to do, this is our chance." Dr. Walker nodded, already beginning to modify his designs. The Keepers had brought time itself as a weapon. Now humanity would use it against them. Deep beneath an abandoned power station, hundreds of people worked in carefully organized shifts. The construction of Project Orphan had been underway for 5 days straight. Dr. Walker moved between different work areas, checking calculations and directing teams of engineers who worked with salvaged equipment. "The main coil needs to be larger," he told a group of technicians. They were building what looked like a massive version of his temporal scanner, but with deadly purpose. Old power station generators lined the walls, ready to channel enormous amounts of energy into the device. Major Stone entered through the lead-shielded doors, bringing news from the surface. "We've lost Paris," she announced grimly. "The Keepers erased the entire city's history. It's just empty fields now, like it was never built." Professor Miller looked up from his workbench, where he was calibrating sensitive temporal meters. "They're getting bolder. Each erasure makes them stronger in our timeline." "How much longer?" Major Stone asked, watching teams of workers hauling heavy copper coils into place. 2 days, maybe 3, Dr. Walker replied. "But there's something else." He led them to a quiet corner where complex equations covered a blackboard. The quantum decoherence cannon will work. It will sever their connection to their home dimension. But the energy release, what about it? Major Stone asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be good. It could ripple through all timelines, Professor Miller explained. When we fire this weapon, we're not just attacking them here and now. We're attacking them across every moment they exist in. The temporal backlash could be significant. Above them, the ground shook as another Timikeeper ship passed overhead. Through special viewing ports in the ceiling, they could see its crystalline structure was now almost completely solid. The aliens were using so much power to erase human history that they were becoming fully anchored in the present. They're playing right into our hands, Dr. Walker said. The more solid they become, the more vulnerable they are to the weapon. But, he hesitated. But what? Major Stone prompted. But whoever fires the weapon will be at ground zero of a temporal explosion, he finished quietly. They'll experience every possible timeline at once. No human mind could survive that. The room fell silent except for the humming of generators and the clank of tools. Everyone knew what that meant. Firing the weapon would be a suicide mission. We'll find a way, Major Stone said firmly. Keep building. The work continued around the clock. Teams of scientists and engineers worked on different parts of the massive device. The main cannon took shape, a huge array of temporal focusing lenses surrounded by spinning rings of copper and lead. The captured alien crystal sat at its heart, pulsing with increasing intensity as more power systems came online. Professor Miller made a breakthrough on the third day. If we modify these field generators, he explained to Dr. Walker, we can create a small safe zone. It won't last long, but it might give the operator a chance to escape. Dr. Walker nodded, but his expression was doubtful. They both knew the changes wouldn't be enough. The weapon would tear apart time itself around the user. Even a few seconds of exposure would be fatal. As the weapon neared completion, more news arrived from the surface. The Timikeepers had erased Rome, Beijing, and Cairo from history. Ancient wonders and achievements disappeared by the hour. Humanity's timeline was being systematically dismantled. Tomorrow, Dr. Walker announced to the gathered workers, we'll be ready to fire tomorrow. That night, as the final calibrations were made, he sat alone in his makeshift office. On his desk lay a single envelope with Major Stone's name on it. Inside was a detailed set of firing instructions for the weapon. He knew he couldn't ask anyone else to operate it. Some prices had to be paid personally. The day of reckoning arrived with a blood-red sunrise. Through the viewing ports of the underground facility, the sky looked wrong. Too many Timikeeper ships filled the air, their crystalline forms now almost completely solid. They had gathered in unprecedented numbers, as if sensing humanity's last desperate plan. Dr. Walker worked frantically at the control panel of Project Orphan, making final adjustments. The massive quantum decoherence cannon hummed with power, its rings spinning faster and faster. The alien crystal at its heart pulsed with a blinding blue light. They know, Major Stone said, bursting into the control room. Somehow they've detected the weapon. They're coming. As if to confirm her words, a massive explosion rocked the facility. Dust fell from the ceiling as emergency lights began flashing. Through the security cameras, they watched as Timikeeper forces phased through the outer walls of the facility. But how? Professor Miller asked, checking the lid shielding. The barriers should have kept them out. They're not hiding anymore, Dr. Walker realized, watching the monitors. They're using so much power to break through that they've become almost completely physical. Look. On the screens, they could see the Timkeepers clearly for the first time. Their true forms were beautiful and terrifying. Beings of pure temporal energy, shaped like humans, but made of shifting light and shadow. Each step they took left burning footprints in the floor, time itself warping around them. Defend the inner chamber, Major Stone ordered through her radio. Teams of soldiers took up positions, though everyone knew conventional weapons would be nearly useless. Dr. Walker turned to Professor Miller. The weapon's not fully calibrated. We need 10 more minutes. You'll have them, Major Stone said grimly, checking her rifle. She knew it wouldn't do much damage, but they had discovered that lead-coated bullets could at least slow the aliens down. Miller, help Walker. I'll coordinate the defense. The next few minutes were chaos. The Timmy-keepers pushed forward relentlessly, their powers growing stronger as they fully manifested in the present. Soldiers fell back step by step, buying time with their lives. The aliens didn't kill their victims. They simply erased them, leaving empty spaces where people had stood moments before. Through it all, Dr. Walker and Professor Miller worked desperately at the weapon's controls. The rings spun faster, the crystal pulsed brighter, and the air itself began to crackle with temporal energy. 2 minutes to full power, Professor Miller shouted over the noise of battle. A massive blast rocked the inner chamber. 3 Timkeepers had broken through, their forms blazing with power. Time distorted wildly around them, in some spots slowing to a crawl, in others racing forward at impossible speed. Take them down, Major Stone ordered, leading the counterattack. Her soldiers fired volleys of lead-coated bullets, forcing the aliens back momentarily. Dr. Walker looked at the weapon's controls, then at the envelope on his desk. Everything was ready. He turned to speak to Major Stone, to explain his plan, but froze at what he saw. The Timmy-keepers had revealed their master stroke. As Major Stone and her soldiers fought, their very memories were being erased. One by one, they forgot how to hold their weapons, forgot why they were fighting, forgot even their own names. Now, Professor Miller shouted, "It has to be now." Dr. Walker reached for the firing controls, but a temporal blast knocked him back. A timekeeper stood before him, its form burning so bright it hurt to look at. Through its shifting face, he could see the truth. These beings existed in all moments at once, seeing past, present, and future simultaneously. "Your species ends here," it said in a voice that echoed through time itself. Dr. Walker looked at the being, then at the weapon's controls just inches away. In that moment, he understood that everything, the entire war, human history itself, would be decided in the next few seconds. Time seemed to stand still in that final moment. Dr. Walker lay on the ground, the timekeeper looming over him, its form blazing with temporal energy. Behind him, Project Orphan hummed with power, its rings spinning so fast they were just blurs of motion. Then Dr. Walker smiled. "You know what's funny?" he said to the alien being. "You've been so busy erasing history that you forgot to check your own future." He pulled a small device from his pocket, the original temporal scanner he'd built, now modified into a remote trigger. The Timekeeper's form flickered as it realized the truth. The control panel had been a decoy. "Now," Dr. Walker shouted. Major Stone, who had been pretending to forget herself, snapped into action. She threw a lead-line shield around Professor Miller, protecting him from what was about to happen. The Timekeeper tried to stop them, but it was too late. Dr. Walker pressed the trigger. The quantum decoherence cannon fired, its blast invisible, but felt by every living thing on Earth. The alien crystal at its heart exploded with blinding light as the weapon tore into the fabric of time itself. The effect on the Timekeepers was immediate and terrifying. Their forms began to splinter, existing in multiple states at once as their quantum coherence shattered. The being standing over Dr. Walker screamed in a voice that echoed through past, present, and future simultaneously. "What have you done?" it cried, its form breaking apart. "The same thing you did to us," Dr. Walker answered, even as he felt time beginning to tear apart around him. "We're erasing you from history." Above ground, the crystalline ships began to fade from existence. The Timekeeper's network, spanning all of time and space, was collapsing. Each alien felt the deaths of all its temporal copies at once, an infinite number of endings happening simultaneously. But the weapon's effect was devastating. Temporal energy cascaded through the facility, reality itself buckling under the strain. Dr. Walker felt his mind being pulled in countless directions as he experienced every possible timeline at once. "Get out," he shouted to Major Stone and Professor Miller. "The containment field won't last long." They tried to reach him, but he pushed them back. Someone had to stay and maintain the weapon's focus, to ensure every trace of the Timmy-Keepers was erased from every timeline. Major Stone understood. With tears in her eyes, she dragged Professor Miller toward the exit. "He's giving us a chance. Don't waste it." As they escaped, Dr. Walker stood at the heart of the temporal storm. He saw everything at once, every possible Earth, every potential future. He watched as the Timmy-Keepers were systematically removed from existence, their influence on history unraveling like threads from a tapestry. The pain was unbearable as his consciousness expanded across time itself, but he held on. The weapon had to complete its cycle. Humanity had to be saved. Then, just before his mind shattered completely, he saw something beautiful. He saw the Earth restored, timelines healing themselves as the Timmy-Keepers' influence faded. He saw cities rebuilding, history rewriting itself, humanity's achievements returning one by one. With his last moment of clarity, Dr. Walker looked at his hands. They were beginning to fade, just like the Timmy-Keepers had faded. The price of using the weapon would be his own erasure from time. He smiled. It was worth it. 1 month later, Major Stone stood in an empty field where the facility had once been. Most people had only scattered memories of the invasion now, like a dream that fades upon waking. The Timmy-Keepers had been completely erased from history, taking all evidence of their existence with them. She held up an old temporal scanner, the last one Dr. Walker had built. It still picked up faint traces of time distortion, echoes of what had happened here. The world had been saved, humanity's timeline restored. But she remembered. She remembered everything. And in her pocket, she carried a single photograph of Dr. Walker, the only proof he had ever existed, the man who had erased himself from time to save everyone else's history.